Okay. Well, anyway, here we are, and we're talking about The Hobbit this morning. And first off, let's start off with introductions again. I know we do it every time, but might as well do it again, right? So how are things in Italy?
We're doing well.
Yeah.
Cold. We have an unprecedented, I don't know, an unseasonal cold snap across the continent here, which means it's hovering in the 40s for us here in central Italy and rainy. Typical winter weather, but we had our March in February, and so we flipped our February into March, such as it is. But
yeah, that's what killed John Keats, I think.
I believe it. There's a dampness to this cold that just goes right into your bones.
Yikes. Dang.
Yeah.
Well, we're at 24 degrees. I thought it'd be warmer today in Minnesota, but in 24, so we're back in that. I mean, we had a couple of days that were nice, but now we're back into that sort of long gray day that winter has in Minnesota. Kind of like being in Peru. Oh, well. There it is.
As long as we're all well.
Yeah, we're all well. Yeah, we're all well. And your family?
Yeah, doing well, thank you.
Good, excellent.
Yeah.
What do you think so far of the shows? Have you seen any of the shows? How I've cut them up and music added and that sort of thing? Take a look.
I must confess that I have not. I have not actually looked at them. I will do so though. I on your recommendation. I think if you've done some editing with that, I think that'll be great. I look forward to seeing that. I tend not to watch things I'm in that way.
Well, if you didn't object, I put a Mussolini mask on your face, just some people
great.
in Italy.
Yeah, they get the Italy thing.
Yeah, if that's okay with you.
I can't see any backlash happening from that at all. No.
Oh, God. You sent over something to me that was really intriguing. That was a Walker Percy quotation, I think, right?
Yeah, from Message in the Bottle.
Yeah, so I think that'd be a good place to begin today. Today we're doing chapter 3 in The Hobbit, and that's the short rest is the title. Or a brief rest? Is it a short rest? A short rest, yeah.
A short rest.
Yeah, and before we got too deep into it, this is the section with Elrond and the moon letters and all. Before we got too deep into it, I was just thinking about this idea of dread in The Hobbit. And that's where I kind of began the conversation, was talking about that idea, the image. Yeah. I think what the genesis of the idea was that, again, I was reflecting on why the Jackson films rub me the wrong way, or why I find them inferior. I mean, there are lots of reasons I do, but one of the reasons is because whenever I read Tolkien, both the Lord of the Rings and even The Hobbit, there's always this sense of dread in the stories. And it doesn't exist in the movies. The movies don't have that same. And so I thought it'd be kind of neat to probe, what does that mean? What is dread? And how is dread different from, say, other forms of fear that we experience? Why would it be something that in literature gives a particular taste or flavor to literature that is actually beneficial or positive? So your quotation,
that's very interesting.
Walker Percy, I think is a good place to look at this idea first of dread and what we mean by dread. Do you want to read that, or should I read that?
I don't know that I'm able to actually pull it up on my mobile whilst filming without losing that. So
Gotcha.
Why don't you go ahead and read that?
Let me go ahead then. This is from Walker Percy, and you say this is Message in the Bottle, right?
I think so. It could be Lost in the Cosmos. I was looking at both of them this morning, preparing for a lecture.
Okay. Walker Percy, for people that don't know, Walker Percy was a 20th century Southern writer, and he wrote a number of very good novels, including Lancelot was one, and The Moviegoer, and the end, what was it called? The End of the World, or something like that.
The Last Gentleman.
The Last Gentleman, that's what it was. And he also wrote these, what he calls self-help manuals, which are kind of whimsical, looking at the strangeness of human psychology. And they're very beneficial for anybody who's interested in that sort of thing. So in this, The Message in the Bottle, he's talking about what's called semiotics. And he's talking about the nature of self-consciousness. And just for clarity's sake, too, Cameron, when we use the word semiotics, what do we mean by that? What does that term mean?
Yeah, semiotics is the study of signs and sign usage. So symbols and their meaning, distinct from, say, signals. Distinct from signals. So signals prompt a stimulus response, like Pavlov's dogs, something like this, where sign is something that has meaning. And human beings, we use signs promiscuously, right? So words, names, we're obsessed with naming things. That's how we import meaning, and this whole creates a whole world for us. So semiotics is the science that studies signs and sign usage, principally focusing on language. It's kind of a subset of linguistics, but also can be applied to art and other such things.
So this was very near and dear to Tolkien's heart.
Oh, yeah.
He was very interested in science, and especially languages. And he frequently made the claim that any language is also a history.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, and you're studying that, right? Is that what you're studying right now, or?
Yeah, I'm brushing up. That is a research focus of mine in general. I'm brushing up on some of my basic semiotics as part of I suppose you could call it an aesthetics course of sorts that I'm teaching as part of a philology faculty at a university over here.
Isn't it funny, whenever you teach something, you always like end up educating yourself in all sorts of realms that you didn't expect to be in.
I know there's whole when you go back and you read something, like, there's whole chapters in here I never saw this before.
I never, when I was a teenager. Okay, so here's the Percy quotation. This is from Message in a Bottle by Walker Percy. As soon as the self becomes self-conscious, that is, aware of its own unique unformulability in its world of signs, from that moment forward, it cannot escape the predicament of its placement in the world. An organism exists in its environment in only one mode, that of an open system responding to those segments of its environment to which it is genetically programmed to respond, or to which it has learned to respond. But a self must be placed in a world. It cannot not be placed. If it chooses by default not to be placed, then its placement is that of not choosing to be placed. And you said that he goes on to talk about the unplaced self as one capable of shame, alienation, ennui, and existential dread. Yeah. So there's that term, unplaced self. Now that's a really interesting term that Percy brings up. He frequently does this. He creates words or combines words in order to get at an idea that is hard to find elsewhere. So what does he mean by the unplaced self, Kevin? Do you have
that is the... What was it?
Do you have an insight into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's identified, without recapitulating the whole of his work on this, because I should say he's a psychiatrist. So he's an interesting person. Let's actually look at him, because I think there's a lot that can be illustrated in his personality in this way. He's a Southern author, sure, but he is and he's got the right background in family history and all of that for that. You know, yeah, exactly, right. There's an uncle who drank himself to death. Another guy drove off a cliff. You know, I mean, like all these sorts of things. You know, just the whole picture, the typical package. But he's a psychiatrist. He's actually an MD psychiatrist who, after, you know, I mean, like in good dramatic fashion, he got sick, was laid up in bed, kind of thing, started reading novels. You know, almost this Ignatius Loyola kind of thing. You know, you hear these great figures in history have a pivot kind of in their career path at an illness, and he takes a turn from practicing psychiatry and doing in terms of like therapy and that kind of thing. He says essentially that tool doesn't work on the modern psyche. So the way to actually apply the medicine that's needed today is through writing novels. And so he wrote stories. This is his way of practicing psychiatry. And then these other works, these nonfiction works of his, scientific works, you could say, are getting at the insights that he's had and trying to unpack these granular things, whereas novels are illustrations of these predicaments played out. So an unplaced self for him is the idea of a self that doesn't know where they are in the world. They don't have a sense of placement within the world. And we need to draw a distinction here, because just before this quote, he's talking about the difference between an organism that does not have language, that does not use signs, but is merely an organism in an environment. He said it's part of an open system that has merely dyadic interactions with its environment. That is stimulus response, stimulus response. It can be more or less complex, but that's essentially what's going on there. So what makes man different is the fact that he or she is a sign user. That is to say, we have signs, we have a word, we have meaning, we have, he draws a lot from sort of the Helen Keller moment.
Yeah.
Like, there's water and there's the sign water. And up to a certain point, it was you could sign the word for cake, right? And you could say we'll just say the word cake, and she would go and get cake. Okay, fine, but that's no different from Skinner's parakeets or Pavlov's dogs.
Yeah.
But then at a certain moment there was that insight that something clicked, and what he calls the delta factor, and that is where she was at the water, and I can't think of, but her teachers, her teachers, I can think of her teacher's name right now, but her teacher was signing the word for water, and then all of a sudden she made the connection. This is water. It doesn't just, it's not just a signal to get water, but this is a thing that has meaning. It has a name, because instantly then she touches down on the ground and says, "What's this?" And then points to this thing. How do you call that? And immediately, what's that? What's that? How do you call these things? And now you're somebody who's not just an organism, right? An organism, any animal, this kind of thing, lives in an environment where they have this stimulus response, but a sign user, a self, you have all of a sudden a consciousness of being in a world. So it's no longer just an environment that you inhabit, but there is a world that's created with the genesis of names, and the naming of things creates a new layer of reality in which you inhabit. And that's a world. And the self has to be placed in that world.
I see.
And you choose not to place yourself. You simply are an alien in that world, a ghost in that world, an unplaced self, something that doesn't fit, doesn't belong, is, to tie in perhaps to the theme of dread, is at home, right? Is unheimlich.
So let me see if I can run this back real quickly. We're not talking here about unplaced self as in I don't have a home in Atlanta, Georgia, or I don't have a home in Berlin or whatever. It's more I'm not placed in a world where the signs and symbols connect to anything real anymore. Is that kind of what it is?
Perhaps not necessarily that. So that is, you feel that you're alienated from them, because you're unsignable, you're uncircumscribable to a sign, because you, the self as subject, can't be captured and placed by a label. So paradoxically, ironically, the alienated self, what's called alienated self, the unplaced self, the alienated self tends to grasp at labels to apply to the self, to try and fit, to try and make yourself stick into the world, sort of like Peter Pan's shadow, trying to rub soap on yourself to get yourself to stick into the world, to be part of it. I'd illustrate it by an example like this, actually. The person who, because you could be a bum living on the streets of Birmingham, or a vagabond wandering through the Blue Ridge Mountains without a home. You don't have a home in Birmingham, but be perfectly placed and feel perfectly at home. Whereas the 9-to-5 middle manager, businessman has a home in Atlanta, and sitting there on a Thursday afternoon on his front porch feels utterly unplaced, utterly alienated, and at home, despite the fact that he's got a wife and kids and a home in the suburbs and everything's hunky-dory.
I get you. Okay, so how does the existential dread emerge out of that? What are we talking about when we talk about existential dread?
The being stuck, the state of, if you are unplaced, you have only two, if you're not in the world, you're not a self in relation with the world, you're alienated from the world, you're forced into one of two modes of existence, and that's either immanence, the self as immanent, that is consumer, producer, living not just materially, but let's just say, for the sake of conversation, materially immanent things, forced by your functionality, an utterly immanent self. Or if you're in this particularly special class, socially speaking, you grasp at transcendence. I'm a scientist with privileged knowledge, or I'm an artist and I have access to the transcendent at these moments. The problem is that you're neither purely immanent nor purely transcendent, but if you have a moment of transcendence from the mundane, there's this problematic reentry when you come crashing back into orbit, when the orbit degenerates.
Yes, I remember
And
reading
that's
about.
this dread, right?
Mm-hmm.
Facing the cosmos, facing the abyss all of a sudden, because when you realize when you're staring into the abyss, but you realize your feet aren't on the ground. It's that feeling in a dream where all of a sudden you're facing the nightmare's dark and it's going to swallow you. You realize all of a sudden there's nothing that you're standing on, you fall.
Yeah, yeah, it was like Alice in Wonderland or something.
Mm.
That's interesting. I mean, I like that idea very much because it's a more profound understanding of dread than even what I sent over to you. Because I sent you these three,
Yeah, those are really cool.
and in order to get at what I'm trying to talk about here with Tolkien here, I like what Percy is suggesting, but I also kind of like what they're suggesting here as well. And we'll see if they match up. I sent three your way, and again, if you didn't get to them, that's fine. It's just putting the for the jury ahead of time. And I had the John Broening, I think his name is, The Literature of Dread at Electric Lit. And I had Rachel Harrison, A Sense of Dread as a Key to Dark Fiction. And then I went to a website called the Masters Review, where they talk about writing. And this is Horror versus Terror, the Vocabulary of Fear. Michel. I don't know Lincoln Michel well. I don't know his work, and I've not read John Broening's before, but I liked what Broening had to say about dread here. Let me read this and just see how this matches up, if at all.
Yeah, please do.
He said, dread is fear of the imminent, of the inevitable. As when an animal is first caught in a trap, in a state of dread, the body and the mind are immobilized and wildly active at the same time. But dread negates suspense. There is no pleasurable uncertainty, no escape, because the outcome is foreknown. The work is based not on suspense, but on dread. If plotted on a graph, it would look like a steadily rising straight line and ending in a preordained point. Or it might resemble something else, a piece of music like Ravel's Bolero. I like that. A reiteration of the same melody, but progressively louder, more intense, more emphatic. In fiction or dramatic art, dread often makes itself felt in the form of dramatic irony, where we know something the characters don't. In Greek tragedies like Oedipus Rex, dramatic irony confirms with heavy regret that those who defy the gods are destined for a dire end. Dread creates a deeply unconsoling work. There is no redemptive moral, no triumph of the human spirit. And there's also no depiction of brutality. There is no afterwards from which we might draw perspective or consolation. There's only the increasingly airless and fantastical atmosphere and the persistent denial and illusioned optimism of all the residents of that world. By not giving us the worst, in other words, dread lets us imagine the worst. So by not giving us the worst, dread lets us imagine the worst. Now he's talking about literature specifically, that in literature, in order to create dread, you don't actually show the thing. It's imminent, you know it's coming, it's headed this way, it's inevitably going to get here, and it's going to be bad. And the image of falling is kind of like that. Well, they say about falling, it's not the fall that kills you, it's a sudden stop at the end, right? You know that when you get to the bottom, it's going to be bad. Right. But what do? You have no parity.
There's nothing you can do. Yeah, that's the dread.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I like that idea that dread is something which is headed our way, and we can't necessarily step up. But we don't see it fully yet. We don't see it fully, and that's what causes the real fear, the real dread. And I think, and going back to Tolkien for a minute, I think Tolkien does this over and over again so well. I was noticing the other day that he doesn't describe the trolls that we talked about last time. Those trolls are not really described. They're huge mountains of flesh, and they are stone creatures, and they have names and they have personalities. But he doesn't go through and tell us the colors of the clothing they're wearing, or what type of shoes they have on, or whether they have a wart, or they don't. He doesn't do that. So because he doesn't do that, you get this sense that these are much more nightmarish creatures, because it's all up here.
Right. It leaves it to your imagination. Yeah.
And I found that over and over again, if you take the example of movies that do that are far more effective. So for instance, the movie Arrival, or the movie The Shining, or the movie Alien, or the movie The Ring, These movies are terrifying. Or the Rear Window is a classic example by Alfred Hitchcock. These movies are terrifying movies because you don't actually see the thing. You know it's coming. You know it's headed your way, but it's not really seen, except by the audience. You know something's going to happen. There's a great scene in Rear Window, for instance. You've seen Hitchcock, of course. There's a great scene where what's his name? Jimmy Stewart is sitting there watching his girlfriend trying to play by the beautiful Grace Kelly. His girlfriend is trying to find something in the apartment of Raymond Burr. And you see Raymond Burr, the killer, coming down the hall towards the door of the apartment. And you know he's going to find her. But he isn't there yet, and he comes out of the shadows of that hallway and he opens the door and he finds her, and there's this moment of confrontation. The tension of the whole scene is that he's coming. She doesn't know that he's coming, but and Jimmy Stewart knows, and it's horrible. It's dreadful. It makes the whole scene that much more powerful.
Yeah.
That image too of dread comes up in the sense of compelling you to watch. It's almost like you have to watch the thing. You have to keep going. I think that's what makes movies like that effective and makes stories like that effective, because it engages us in wanting to find out what's going to happen. When the thing jumps out at you and you see it, it's over. There's no more discussion and no more terror. It's there. So if I can, this is Rachel Harrison writing in that article, very brief here. It says, dread is at the core of all dark fiction, whether it be thriller, psychological suspense, mystery, crime, or horror. Dread compels us to keep reading, to keep watching, to look even though we know we won't like what we see. Something bad is about to happen, and whatever is coming quickly. I like that when I apply that to Tolkien's work. I think all of Tolkien's work is surrounded by a sense of dread that I don't see at all in the Jackson movies. And by that I mean, all the time when you're reading The Hobbit or when you're reading The Lord of the Rings, there's always something out there on the outskirts that's terrifying, something unknown. And like in The Hobbit, it's the dragon, for instance. You're headed towards the dragon. You don't know what it's going to be like, but it's going to be bad. And it's inevitable. What's it going to be like when you get there? And that gets totally diffused in the movie, because in the movie, of course, you get there and it's CGI Benedict Cumberbatch, just kind of loses the whole thing. But in the book, because again, you don't see the dragon, it's this dreadful thing that you have to meet even after all the other things you've had to meet too. Right. So his story is not just dreadful in the sense of finding the dragon. It's dreadful in the sense that when you know the larger lore, there's so much else that's going on the periphery. There's a necromancer, for instance. There's all those wars that have occurred before. There's the imminent leaving of the elves. Let me just take that for just a second as I wax eloquent here. The elves in Lord of the Rings are all leaving for the Undying Lands, and you see them drifting away. There's scenes where Frodo and the others meet them. And I always love that scene because it's beautiful, and meeting the elves is a wonderful thing, but there's also something dreadful about it. That the elves are drifting away in the slow attrition of elvish power. And I find it to be, it's like a creeping terror. Something's coming, something's headed this way. It's causing all the rats to flee the ship, or the elves to flee Middle Earth.
Right.
Like some horror movie where you see all the creatures fleeing out, and whatever's coming is worse than all the creatures. So
that's right.
Or something. So I think what I'm getting at here is that this idea of dread in Tolkien is a positive thing. I think it's a positive thing. And I think that Walker Percy, it's a positive thing too. Let me start with Percy. I think Percy would suggest that the dread is something that should prompt a person to take stock of life and to wake up to the fact that there's a deep emptiness in their life, so that they don't continue on the same trajectory of just hollow daily existence. His image, for instance, of how does he put it? Re-entry. His image of the re-entry is something which is terrifying. You're falling back into the world, but it's a reminder of how hollow your world is and how you need change.
That's exactly it. It's a reminder. It's that feeling of yeah. It's a reminder of how hollow your world is. That all things are vanity, vacuous, empty, and void.
And I wonder with Tolkien too. I think it's a positive thing because I wonder with him he wasn't making literature consciously like Percy was in order to cure the world, I suppose you could say.
Right.
He was making literature primarily because he loved it and he wanted a venue for his languages. But at the same time, here he is creating a world that does remind us of something greater than this world. And language which reminds us of things of beauty and characters and action. That's why he's developed such a tremendous fan base, and if we can call it that. People love his works because of that.
Yeah. And I mean, interesting thing is one of his, if you really want to get into dread in the works of Tolkien, and this is like not safe for anybody under 25, the Narnikin Húrin, the children of Húrin, the tragedy that he wrote about that's dark, and that is you know how it's going to end essentially, because Morgoth tells Húrin, I'm going to do some real nasty things to your kids that are still living around. And every one of your line is going to do this, like Oedipus Rex plus, terrible things are going to happen. You don't know what, but you know it's coming. And so you read through and you know things the character doesn't. It's this, I mean, it's a thick, long sequence of just dreadful, dreadful moments after
Yes, it is. And this is in the days before Hannibal Lecter or any of those mass murder types in cinema or literature.
Right.
So the dragon or the Morgoth character, they kind of are like that. All those things that I could do end up being far more terrifying than all the things that he actually ends up doing.
Right.
Yeah, and then we'll get to it eventually, but when Bilbo faces Smaug is a particularly good instance of this kind of dread. We'll get to it down the road. But I like the idea here that even in this resting place, there is this sense of dread that surrounds the outside of Rivendell. So, for instance, Rivendell is in a valley area, and we think of valley as it's nice and pretty, but valley was always associated with something dark. I mean, you got the Green Knight who goes into this dark valley. Gawain goes into the dark valley to find the Green Knight. Or you've got Arthur, when he goes in to find his sword, he goes through this dark valley, a terrifying valley. Or you've got the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Or even to use a pop reference, you've got in the, what is it, where the ROUSs exist, the Dark Forest, where the rodents of unusual size.
Right.
Yeah. It's in a valley.
Down in a valley.
No. And so Rivendell is in the middle of a valley, and even the name itself has always struck me as interesting because it's a riven dell. Yeah. That riven means torn or split, separated, if I'm not mistaken. And a dell is a small hollow in the ground. So this is a small hollow that's been split apart. So it's not entirely calm and peaceful and beautiful, although it is calm and peaceful and beautiful at the center of it. And it's called the Last Lonely House. But
exactly, and I would just to the it's not in a calm and peaceful and beautiful kind of place. The sense just before they come up, I'm just going to quick pull here. They're looking for it, and goodness, where is it here? They come to the edge of a steep fall in the ground, so closely, so suddenly that Gandalf's horse nearly slipped down the slope. So they're going along a level plain, which has bogs. Which he said, and so he sets this up. He says there's these, where is it? The only path was marked with white stones. There were beautiful bogs. Here we go. There were bogs, some of them green, pleasant places to look at, with flowers growing, bright and tall. But a pony that walked there with a pack on its back would never have come out again.
Yes, right. I remember that.
And so you get this sense of the land that they're walking on is beautiful but perilous. Deadly if you misstep, you'll be into like it's like being in the dark forest.
One false move,
right? There's the lightning sand.
Yeah.
One false move and you're down, and then they come to the edge and they almost fall off the precipice into the abyss, and it's precisely into the abyss that they need to go to get to Rivendell.
Well, isn't that an interesting place for elves to live too?
Right.
Elves always in literature seem to live in these wild areas or these misty areas, or
You've come to the edge of the wild, he said.
On the edge of the wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they are living in the middle of this riven area, this dangerous area, which not even Gandalf knows, which I find kind of startling.
Right.
Gandalf's supposed to know everything, right? He's supposed to be the guide. He's the one who knows all this stuff. But there's a scene where Gandalf is trying to find the path down, and he can't find
Yeah.
it. I love that. Here's the text. It says, Gandalf's head and beard wagged this way and that as he looked for the stones, and they followed his lead, but they seemed no nearer to the end of the search when the day began to fail. Tea time had long gone by, and it seemed supper time would soon do the same, which I love the tip of the hat to Bilbo's bourgeois nature.
That's right.
There were moths fluttering about, and the light became very dim, the moon had not risen. Bilbo's pony began to stumble over roots and stones that came to the edge of a steep fall on the ground, so suddenly Gandalf's horse slipped down the slope. Here it is at last, he called. The others gathered round him and looked over the edge. So the passage that you were referring to, where Gandalf almost slips down the edge, is he's looking for the path. He can't find the right path, which is, it seems odd, because he's supposed to know everything. But it's indicative of the idea that even the wisest in the company has a hard time finding the place.
Right.
The sense that he's not going to find it. They're going to be stuck out there in the wild. I think it says somewhere in there that they were running low on supplies by that point.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Just before then, he says you've got. Oh goodness. Yeah, we need to go to this place essentially because we're short on food.
Yeah.
We need to rest, and most of all, we need to be able to. We need a guide. We're coming up from the Misty Mountains, and we'll all die there if you don't get somebody who's going to tell you the right way to approach them.
Right. Which is funny too, because Bilbo, who is still very provincial, he looks at the mist. He says, "Is that it? Is that the mountain?
Right? Is that the lonely mountain?" No.
I got nothing. No, it's nothing. This is, these mountains that we're seeing now are brief, they're small, but it's again a sense that Bilbo doesn't quite know how bad things are going to be or how dangerous things are going to be, and so there's an increasing dread again in him about the possibility of it being worse than it really is. Mm-hmm. If I can just point to one more thing, which I found interesting in my research this the other day, in that article that I passed away, the Master's Review, they pointed out a difference between dread, terror, horror, and revulsion, which I thought was worthwhile.
Yeah. Could you explain that a little bit? Unpack that.
Yeah. They talked about how fear is one of the deepest human emotions. Fear is right up there with anger and love.
Yeah.
The three of the deepest emotions we have as human beings. And dread is, they said, was the fear of the imminent or the inevitable, but it's a fear of an unseen thing. And we often use the word terror to synonymous with this. And dread involves not seeing something that you know is coming, and that leads to this overwhelming, as you said, feeling like you're falling out of yourself. Okay, so. Terror or dread, then they also say, is a feeling of dread and apprehension of the possibility of something frightening. So it's something being possibly frightening. But then you have horror, which they distinguish from dread, and they say that's the shock and repulsion of seeing the frightening thing. So when you feel terror, you don't see the thing yet, but you know it's coming. It's inevitably coming. When you feel horror, you feel shock and revulsion because suddenly it's there. You've seen it. And the other thing is, once you've seen it, you have some level of familiarity and power over it. And so it stops being so fearful.
Right.
It's now more just a practical threat. There's a great scene in the movie The Impossible, which is about that tsunami, Boxing Day tsunami.
Okay.
Back in the 2000s. And Naomi Watts is in there, I think, and Obi-Wan Kenobi from the first Star Wars movies.
Okay.
Spider-Man from the Marvel comics. So it's got some good in it. But anyway, the scene where the tsunami hits is dreadful, and in the real sense of the word. You hear the rumblings, the birds flying over, the trees in the horizon start to collapse, and then suddenly you see this wave coming over the tops of these houses and crashing in on them. And then once it's hit, it becomes horror. I mean, it is dreadful, and they do it very well. But then she's tumbling through the water. You see her tumbling through the water. It's just horrible. It's like, wow, this is really bad news. But it's no longer just what the hell is coming. It's now, how is she going to get out of this? How are you going to deal? Because you've seen the thing. And now it's just a practical question. What are you going to do with it now that you've seen it and you've kind of conquered it in a way and become familiar with it? Then the last one is revulsion. And revulsion is simply a gross out factor. And normally here, most of the instances that I've read about, fear prompts people to be physically ill, that we actually get like vomiting. And so revulsion is that sense. It's, you've seen the thing and it's horrifying now, so you have to deal with it, but you also feel you're fighting this nausea at it. Point here is that when you deal with a really good work, you're dealing with a work that has to do with dread or terror. And a secondary work would be something that's horrifying. It's just practically, how do you get out of the zombie wasteland? You know, it's horrifying. It's no longer terrifying. It's now just horror. And then the revulsion, that's the lowest level. That's just that, you know, disgusting stuff happening, and you have to try not to be sick. Tolkien almost never deals with revulsion. I find this interesting, that he has very few instances of being revolted at things or writing about revulsion. Tolkien doesn't write about revulsion hardly at all. And he writes horror, where you have to deal with something, but he really specializes in dread. The thing is about to show up, is just around the corner. You know it's going to happen, or it's on the periphery of some kind. I mean, even that picture of the trolls that he painted one where the trolls were gathered around the fire, but the one he actually approved was his ink drawing of the trolls hiding behind trees. They're hidden. And he was wise enough in his writing that he never actually tells you the trolls, even when they're most terrifying, which is in the battle there of Moria in The Lord of the Rings. He doesn't actually show them. There's a line Gandalf says, there must be a great cave troll with them, but they don't ever show the trolls. And later the trolls are the ones that are bringing up the stones at Khazad-dûm to cross the bridge, but he doesn't actually describe them. So your imagination is running wild. What's a troll look like? And I was reflecting on the other great animation of Ralph Bakshi, when he shows trolls only partially coming through the door, and Frodo runs up and stabs him with his little sting. Jackson, when I first saw the Lord of the Rings movie, and they show the trolls as these big lumps of stone with birds making nests in their hair, and I thought, well, that's cool, because he doesn't actually show the trolls. And so you get that sense of dread. Unfortunately, later in the movie, at the Battle of Moria, he actually shows a big CGI troll, and it's like, well, what's, big deal? It loses everything. Tolkien is amazing. He never really does that. He never actually shows you that terrifying thing, so that you don't have the chance to move from terror to horror and then to just mere revulsion. He doesn't do CGI work at all. So I think that in this part of the story, that dread is all around us at Rivendell, in the wasteland and the darkness of the valley that they're in. But then you get that beautiful world of the elves situated in the middle of it. And what is that? What is that telling us? What does it say that in the middle of that dread, there's that beautiful world? What do you think?
Well, I think, one of the things that occurred, too many thoughts converging at once. There's the first level. Like I say, there's multiple layers of things that appear to me on this, and I think at the first layer, you're wandering in the amidst these bogs where you could disappear at any moment. You're not sure where you're going. Evidently, your guide doesn't know where you're going either. Thanks a lot, wizard. Like, what? I mean, you just put yourself in the position of the dwarves, particularly more cynical even than Bilbo. But he's not sure where it is. tea time is, I mean, to put it in Bilbo terms, like, this is awful. Tea time has gone by and supper time looks like it's going to pass as well. Like, this is actually really bad. You know, I sympathize with the poor, plump little bourgeois rabbit that he is. He's caught out there. I mean, think if you were a rabbit, you're caught up there on the flat rock. You know,
Yeah.
it's wide, flat, open spaces for as far as the eye can see. And you're supposed to drop down. What we discover is that the whole goal is to drop down into some place like the Grand Canyon and go down into this dark ravine. And I want to say, like, so where I live here, not far from here by car, there are such valleys as this. And so, you know, to see, you know, often I think we tend to think of valleys or conceive of valleys as these broad open places between mountains. There's a gradual slope. I think you're absolutely right to identify the narrowness, that driving in one of those is a harrowing experience, because oftentimes it means there's a sheer cliff drop down the other side, you know, sheer cliff drop down one side as you're driving, you know, because you're driving on the cliff face often, and then it goes straight up beside you. There's not much room for maneuvering, and they don't get much sunlight in these valleys. They're dark. You see, an enemy could be looking down at you from up above at any given moment, which means you've got somebody who's above you looking down. I mean, so ordinarily this kind of ravine, though it can hide you from enemies who are just searching the plain, right? They'd never even see that the valley was there. It can also trap you.
Yeah.
It can also be a place of entrapment. In fact, often valleys are, or places of battle. Right, they're the straits which two armies have to go through, or one particularly large army being held off by 300, who ultimately died at the last man. And in fact, that's then another layer is that Rivendell, when you know the histories, that was essentially a besieged fortress. It was a last stronghold of the elves in the dark days of Sauron, which then this morning, as I was thinking over this, made me realize that the last homely house, which I've always only interpreted in geographical terms, it's the last one on the road before you're really in the wild, right? It's on the borderlands or the Shadowlands, between not wild and the wild, which is the, you know, like, that's where the entrances to fairy always are, to the fairyland, the land, this mystical other realm, are always somewhere in the borders between the enclosed space of the tame and then the wild. And so it's natural that we would want to find them there. But the idea that this is the last one, like, there were others and they're gone now.
Oh,
You know, that sense of the last.
So it's not last geographically last on the map. It's last as in others, and this one is the only one remaining.
Yeah, I mean, it is that geographically, but when you understand that the elves have really, even by this point, for the most part, removed to the Undying Lands or been sunk in the sea. You know, when Numenor when essentially the Atlantis goes down underwater, the waters rise. They flood all of you know, Eregion. Doriath is gone. These other kingdoms, these other homely houses are gone, long gone, and this is perhaps the last one. Which is interestingly puts Elrond in an interesting position of being a great lore master. He's in some ways the last scion of a great legacy.
Yes, which is tremendous on the part of Tolkien. I don't know whether he thought this all out when he was writing The Hobbit, but certainly when he wrote it, you know.
Exactly, when he rebuilds background for it.
That Elrond has been around for a long, long time.
Yeah.
That he was there when, with Gil-galad, when Elendil when Isildur cut the ring from the finger of Sauron. And he's seen these different ages come and go. And yet, he doesn't go around scowling and frowning all the time.
Exactly. Which is a difference with the movies again. I hate going back to that, but...
Yeah, as much as I like that actor, you know, he's very good in The Matrix and other things, but he wasn't Elrond. But Elrond doesn't go around scowling. He goes around... The first time I met Elrond when I was a kid... You're like, wow, it's an elf. You know, you have that Sam Gamgee kind of response. Yeah, Christmas. He's a character who seems intelligent and calm, and nothing can harm him. And yet he's cheerful. There's a certain delight in Elrond that we get in this chapter. So like, moon letters. Let me see your sword. You know, there's never this sort of, let me see your sword. You know. there's nothing sinister about him, which I find tremendous, because after all of that, you'd think the guy would be a PTSD, to say the least.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing sinister or cynical.
No,
He's
no.
wise and calm,
Yes.
and even joyful.
Yes, and you get that even in the description of his home, that Rivendell is good for singing or eating or sleeping or whatever you want to be doing.
Yeah.
It's a place of calm and rest and peace, meditation, in the middle of all of it.
Right. In the midst of it all. And that's, just like the, as we talked, as I mentioned in one of our previous episodes too, about singing, at the end of the story, Bilbo finally learns to sing. And there's a deep importance to that. And we encounter more singing here, the singing of the elves. We've had so far the singing of the dwarves, and now we see the singing of the elves. But tabling that for a moment, here it's talked about as the last homely house. As they approach it and as they leave it, it's the last homely house. And both in the geographical and the temporal, the chronological sense, the last one.
Mm.
But then when they're coming back, at the very end of the book, chapter 8 identifies, and thus they came upon the last, or the first, homely house. So now there's not just a reversal of fortunes, not just a birth and death and rebirth, new life. These are the themes that we see sort of in the going there and back again, but of the story, but that it's reframed also as, instead of the last, it's now the first. Not just the first one they encounter on their way home towards civilization and a tame world, but because Bilbo's a new hobbit, he has changed, as Gandalf remarks at the end when he starts singing. They've come to the first homely house, and so there's a sense that this is not the last, but it's a pivot point. It's a pivot point.
It's very intriguing, especially if you put it in the larger context of Lord of the Rings, because Gandalf says there that killing a Smaug is a very important piece in the age, and not only the Smaug, of course, but the finding of the ring, as we get later on. The finding of the ring is the thing that sets in motion the events that lead to the downfall of Sauron and the end of the age, and thus the establishment of new homely houses. So in a way, you can say that this homely house, after the destruction of Smaug, this homely house does become the first of many still to come.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool.
That's the implication.
That's cool. Let me look at another aspect of it too, Cameron, if you don't mind, because we're talking about the beauty of elves is truly astounding in Tolkien. And again, because he doesn't describe them in detail, much of it is your imagination. But you know that it involves light and elegance and a sort of medieval calm and all these wonderful ornate skills and crafts that they have. Nothing spiky about the elves, which again, not a slam against Jackson, but it is a slam against Jackson. There's nothing spiky about them. There's this elegance and smoothness about them. And yet they're in the middle of all this dark chaos and trolls everywhere and the Sauron on the perimeter. That reminds me a great deal of the idea that, well, let me back up. In the woods, normally you would expect to find Baba Yaga's house. Or in the woods, you'd expect to find a grandmother's house that's been invaded by a wolf.
Right.
What you find here, though, is not that. You find something calm in the midst of that darkness, which then allows you to continue on your journey. And in the next book, allows you to really begin the journey with the fellowship. It reminds me of two poems immediately come to mind, one by Emily Dickinson and another one by, I think, Theodore Roethke? Yeah, Theodore Roethke. And the one by Emily Dickinson, which is the shorter. This is a poem by Dickinson called After Great Pain a Formal Feeling Comes. You know this one?
It's been since probably high school that I've heard it, but it sounds familiar all of a sudden.
Emily Dickinson, because she seems so ordinary and plain, and then you delve into her work and she's extremely complex. Yeah. This is a short one, and it says, after great pain a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questioned, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before. The feet mechanical go round, a wooden way of ground or air or aught, regardless grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go. And it seems at first like a depressing poem, like, oh, that's Dickenson again being Dickenson, Gothic Dickenson, it sucks. But
Right.
really, when you start looking at the poem, what she's saying is the dread is the dread of death, the horror, the dread of death. And once you get over that terror, once you go through that terror, there's this feeling, this sense that you just keep going and that you are able to accomplish your life, move forward in your life, and accomplish what you need to do by simply going through the motions. And then finally, how she put it, it's a quartz contentment. You become content. You're okay with it. The dreadful thing is not so bad as you thought it was. And now you move forward. So her poem is not about just a stupor, or just dying. It's about letting go something at the end. And what's she letting go? I think what the letting go is letting go of the thing you loved that got lost, but also letting go of the dread, that you can let that go. And now it passes into the past. It's like I got to find it because I will misquote it, right? Dune, right?
Yes, thank you. That was hoping you're going there with that.
I have to look it up though, because I must make sure that I say it correctly.
Yeah.
The Litany Against Fear. Now, Dune, I find it a marvelous work. It's an atheist work, not as good as Tolkien, but it is a magnificent work in certain respects. The Litany Against Fear goes, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I'll permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. So if we take Dickenson and we take Frank Herbert's work back to Jeremy Tolkien, I think what Tolkien is doing is he's embodying this same principle. Rivendell, as you pointed out, has seen siege. It has seen warfare. It has been around for a long time. It is in the middle of the waste, the dark, the chaos. And yet it is a still, small voice in the middle of that. It's a stillness at the center of it, which allows them to recuperate and then go on their journey in the same way that Frodo does later on in the text. Can I share the last one too, which is the Roethke poem?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, please do.
His poem is called In a Dark Time. It's written in 1960, which is a dark time. In a dark time, the eye begins to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood, a lord of nature weeping to a tree. I live between the heron and the wren, beasts of the hill and serpents of the den. What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? The day's on fire. I know the purity of pure desire. My shadow pinned against a sweating wall, that place among the rocks, is it a cave or a winding path? The edge is what I have. A steady storm of correspondences, a night flowing with birds, a ragged moon, and in broad day the midnight come again. A man goes far to find out what he is, death of the self in a long tearless night, all natural shapes blazing on natural light. Dark, dark my light, and darker my desire. My soul, like some heat-maddened summer fly, keeps buzzing at the sill. Which eye is I? A fallen man, I climb out of my fear. The mind enters itself, and God the mind and one is one, free in the tearing wind. Stop that. That ending, right?
Yeah.
One is one, free in the tearing wind. That you had the crap kicked out of you, but you stand up suddenly. You're like, okay, let's do this.
Just walking out of your cottage in Ireland in winter, it's just.
Oh, I just love that, and I really think that's, for me, that's why Tolkien has been so enduring over all these years. I'm 52, and I remember getting Tolkien for the first time when I was 6, and he's still my favorite author, and I think it's because of this, because Tolkien over and over again has these images of people on the brink of total loss, sometimes at the point of total loss, and then they recover, and they stand up and keep going. Like Sam carrying Frodo at the end of the Lord of the Rings. Or Bilbo going down to the tunnel of Smaug, it's this instance where you find this peace, this inner calm, and you keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's, what we're told later when we get to that point where Bilbo descends into the dragon's lair. He said he paused, and it was at that moment that he did the bravest thing, even though, in all the other deeds, like that's the pivotal moment for his moral character development.
Yeah. And I love, I'm not trying to consciously pull this back, but in this chapter, you've got the image of maps and how maps are always like, you know where you're going. This is going to show you where you're going. What it doesn't show you is the perils you're going to meet on the way. But it does show you, like, here's the plan. This is what we're going to be doing. And Bilbo loves that. He gets into maps and he's able to look at, he's the first one who's eager to find out what's on this map when Elrond and then Elrond reveals the moon letters. Well, like we know in this text, the moon letters on the maps, they show up only at certain times of the moon, phases of the moon.
Right.
And they are invisible letters otherwise, painted, I think, with or drawn with mithril, if I'm not mistaken.
Something, there's some, mithril is involved, otherwise it's some sort of alchemical process that,
What
they're
is that?
hidden. They're hidden from view.
Yeah. And what is that?
Something. Sorry, say that again. It cut out.
What is it supposed to be for us? If for us, like the map is supposed to be the guide for us and the way we're going.
Yeah.
What are the letters that show up on the map supposed to represent? Or supposed to be for us?
Well, that's, this is the beautiful thing. Is I've always wondered since I was a kid. They say, are there any other letters on the map? There are any others there, Bilbo asks. And Elrond replied, none to be seen by this moon. And he says, and that's it, like, none to be seen by this moon, which implies that there could very well be others. What others are written there? What other tales are there that do not, it's almost as though you could use it, this, not Tolkien, the author, but the Elrond, be like, yes, but they do not enter into this tale, and avert, or that is a tale that should be told another time, as a repeated refrain in the Never-Ending Story, for instance. That there's potentially all these other rivulets of tale, of story that we could follow if this had happened under another moon. But I think the key thing here is that, so this, they needed to know what it says, and I suppose we should clarify for those who are not as fresh with the story as we are. What does it say? What's this? Elrond said. There are moon letters here beside the plain runes, which say 5 feet high at the door and 3 may walk abreast. That is what was written in regular ink. What are moon letters? Says the Hobbit. He loved maps, as I've told you before, and he also liked runes and letters and cunning handwriting, although he himself wrote a bit thin and spidery, which I identify with as well myself. Moon letters are rune letters, but you cannot see them, said Elrond. Not when you look straight at them. You cannot see them when you look straight at them. They can only be seen when the moon shines behind them. And what is more, with the more cunning sort, it must be a moon of the same shape and season as the day when they were written. The dwarves invented them and wrote them with silver pens, as your friends could tell you. These must have been written on a midsummer's eve in a crescent moon, a long while ago.
Wow.
So what do they say, though? They say, he reads, stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. So it's the key to entering the mountain by that secret door.
Yeah.
Because if they didn't know this, they'd arrive at the secret door and be like, congratulations, it's here somewhere. You don't have you got a key, but there's no keyhole. It's not there. Or you don't know how to find it.
Which they do until Bilbo remembers the thing anyway, right?
Right. He's like, hey, wait a minute. Duh, there was this stuff we read. But this is a vital piece of information which they wouldn't have been able to find. They wouldn't have known this existed, that information was there, had they not arrived at Rivendell at the precise night that they did. That is to say, midsummer night. Which is also a fey moment in the season. There's these, so Rivendell is really a pivotal place. So we have to see everything that happens in here is the bridge is on the idea of a bridge. In fact, there's repeated the image of a bridge. And the elves, when they get down to the valley, redirect them to get to the house. You have to go across this bridge, and it's a perilous bridge. There's no railings, and the dwarves kind of scramble across it on their hands and knees, afraid to fall off. And so this is a bridge. Elrond himself is a bridge. He is one of the he's one of those people whose fathers come into the strange stories before the beginnings of history. In those days of the tales, there were still some people who had both elves and heroes of the north for their ancestors, and Elrond, the master of the house, was their chief. So he himself is a bridge between the elves and men. And elves, again, is always in the context of fairy, the land of fairy, this mystical land. So here we are at the border, the bridge of the wild. There's a bridging point in the tale. Elrond himself is a bridge. So there's all this pivotal moment. And if it's the last and the first homely house, we've got a bridge not only between here and there, but he's, as a lore master, bridging the past to us. And this is a moment where one of those glimpses of lore from the past is bridged in all of its shining moonlight glory to us.
But I gotta break in.
On Midsummer's Eve of all times. I mean, somewhere there's a speech by Mercutio about the fairy queen about this here.
Yeah, Queen Mab.
Yeah.
I gotta break in too, because what is semiotics? It's a bridge.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yes.
All signs and symbols are bridges between us. They allow us to recognize that we are not alone.
Right.
That there's a world there that we can be placed in. And how did Odin get the runes that he refers to here? Tolkien's runes are derived from Norse runes.
Right.
And Norse runes are very distinct among the languages of human beings because they're all, first off, they're very straight things, but they're always considered magical. Most people consider writing magical. But they're also derived in a very specific way. Odin is crucified on a tree, an oak tree, I think. And while he is suffering, in the midst of his suffering, he reaches a point of calm, and he looks down and he sees the twigs that have fallen from the tree on the ground, arranged in letters. And those letters are the runes that then he takes. When he gets released from his suffering, he takes them to men and he gives them to men as writing.
So they're understood to be a pattern of something in the divine realm.
Yes. Yes.
Like these letters form something that is they're a reflection of some reality that's up there.
But they're also derived from being crucified.
Yeah.
On a tree.
Right.
So that language, or our understanding of the world, our symbolic understanding, is derived through this suffering of crucifixion on a tree.
Mm-hmm.
A bridge between heaven and earth, if you will.
Right. Yeah, being suspended between the two in the midway.
And in the midst of that calm, like what Roethke says, or like Emily Dickenson says, in the midst of that calm, when the suffering finally ceases, you get a moment of calm, and that's the bridge that then allows you to comprehend the world, see the world, face the world. If I can, it's very much like the suffering that Christ undergoes creates the bridge between man and God.
That's it. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Wow. So the letters, and I mean, I don't know whether Tolkien was thinking about all this, but dang, it's amazing that he puts all the symbols, midsummer and runes and the moon and the crescent moon, which is a symbol of Artemis.
Right.
Things in it. There's an interesting story in Greek mythology where Artemis, who is the patron of young girls, when girls become women, that is when they enter into their menses, they would have a ceremony where they took their dolls or whatever their toys were and they would lay them at the statue of Artemis. And now they're devoted to Hera or Aphrodite or Athena. But Artemis was a bridge in a way between young childhood, naivete, and the knowledge of self, which occurs as an adult. That's how she wasn't just the hunter goddess. She was the hunter goddess who cared for the naive youngsters until they can make that jump into adulthood. So Artemis, moon, that's the only time you can see these letters.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's and and then so so she's custodian of them up to a certain point.
Yeah.
And in the same way, this being, Rivendell being, especially in early Tolkien work, is supposed to be essentially like stepping into fairy.
Yeah.
And as soon as you're touched by something fairy or elvish, or you become an elf friend, your life changes and strange adventures begin to befall you. You have a hard time staying in just this world. You find yourself walking on paths familiar, and all of a sudden coming to yourself and realizing you're in the middle of a dark wood in the wild.
I woke up in the middle of this life, right?
Right. And so something changed. Like, this is the portal now where Bilbo is changed and transformed. He's been touched. He's been tagged by something fey.
Yeah.
From here on out.
Yeah. And it's in the form of knowledge that comes through runes that are seen in the moon in midsummer, which is a series of different symbols that are lined up one on top of the other.
Yeah.
Which I can't help but think, in terms of Tolkien's genius, I can't help but think that that's not intentional.
That has to be intentional, at least.
Yeah.
That element. I mean, especially given that he writes about, on fairy stories and the role of the wild and fae, the borderlands and transitioning into fairy.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember where it was I read it, but I read somewhere that every fictional work should change you, affect you, plant a seed in you that then grows. That's what they should do.
Yeah.
The whole of fictional work is to move a person and to move them emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually.
And this is why it's important to be attentive to the stories that we allow to enter into us, because our very sense of self, going back to Walker Percy, is languaged, is worded, right? We're promiscuous sign users, speaking of words. The queer thing called language that man somehow seems to have, which also makes us queer, strange, somewhat fey in the world of organisms. And we're storied. Our very identity is itself a narrative. The way we think about ourselves, who I am, is a story. We often carry around these stories unconsciously, unawares. And our stories are shaped, are framed, are understood and lived out in the context of the stories that we believe ourselves to be a part of, which is to say the stories that we allow to enter into us. And like DNA coding can change our narrative.
Yeah. What is it the Romano Guardini says, right? I think I quoted this last time.
Yeah.
A symbol is as real as a chemical or a bodily organ.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, because the story that you end up adapting, the story you end up adapting and telling is the story you live by.
Mm-hmm.
Ended this great talk on Chaucer and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.
Yeah.
And what made clear is that the stories that the characters in Chaucer tell, they're supposed to tell the best story they know so that they can earn this prize. Well, if you're going to tell the best story you know, that's going to be the story you live by. So all those stories you read in Chaucer are actually revealing who the person is who's telling them. Yeah. And that's why, too, I'm not be totally tangential, but I'm following along in this whole kerfluffle going on about the Amazon Rings of Power series.
Okay.
And the fans are responding. And a lot of these fans that are responding, they're terribly angry about this. And they're vocal about their anger, but they can't quite articulate why they are angry. And I think this is why. It's because the Tolkien stories are so powerful and they speak so deeply to a person, anybody, that when you go to live your life, you live it like Aragorn, or you live it like Legolas, or you live it like Bilbo or Frodo. So when somebody goes and monkeys with it, they're not monkeying just with some story.
Right.
Hulk number 37, right? Don't change Hulk number 37. This is your change. You're monkeying with the story of my life.
Yeah.
Don't do that. It is almost the same fervor I think people have over their religious story, because the religious story you live by is equally deep and closely wedded to what the internal person is.
Yeah. And that Tolkien set out to do very intentionally.
Yes.
He's a myth maker. This is mythopoiesis.
Yes.
And that's what that is. This is a religious story. It's myth in the same way that all myths are.
Sure. Sure. He writes another story called Smith of Wootton Major, which
Oh yeah.
and I love that where
Yep.
the young guy gets the cake and he eats the cake, accidentally eats the star in the
The
cake.
fairy star.
Yeah, and it changes him. So he's no longer able to do what he was doing before. He's no longer just an ordinary guy doing his daily existence, which is a good thing, I think.
Right.
Because, like we pointed out earlier, that Walker Percy's idea of the unplaced person, when you live a life that is without story, or live a life without adventure, or you live a life without any kind of purpose or meaning, you're just a cog. You end up being just this hopeless kind of spring in the machine.
Yeah.
You're like W.H.
You're just a tooth on the gear in a machine, as Broening says.
Yeah, tooth on the gear. I love that. W.H. Auden has the great poem, The Unknown Citizen.
Yeah.
Where it works for E.L. Fudge or whatever, Fudge Odors. He never changes. And I think at the core, most everybody is aboard of that. We are repulsed by that idea. Because there's something innate in us that desires that adventure.
Right.
Or maybe more accurately, there's something in us that dreads the fact that we have to go on that adventure. And if
that adventure's coming, whether
it's coming, whether you like it or not. And
right.
if that's the case, we want to have something that's going to give us meaning and purpose, a weapon or tool or a gift, a calm place from which to start.
Right. Because otherwise, and I think a way of imaging this, or a way of telling that sense, that dread of what is it that you dread, right?
Yeah.
In that ceaseless mediocrity, the repeated thing over and over, and never amounting to it, never going on the adventure, is that the adventure will come nonetheless, right? You have to take the great train sometime, but in Michel Anda's the never-ending story, this is precisely what the nothing is it's that eating away of what could be. Essentially, it's eating away of fairy into the nothingness, because people no longer have access to the signs. They're no longer faithful to that world of fairy. They can't access it. They can't get to it. And so it dies, and it becomes this black nothingness, which then eats away. And there's a moving, terrifying, there's a dreadful scene in the book at some point. Atreyu, the alter ego of Bastian, both as our books, who's reading the story, but Atreyu, a character in the story, is sort of his alter ego. This hero is also a young boy, but is in a certain island within the story, and the nothing is coming. This black emptiness is coming, and is coming to devour the island. He happens to have fallen off his luck dragon, and he's there on the island, and the people who live on the island have become ghoulish and zombie-ish, and they're in this ghastly, macabre procession in the wrong direction. Atreyu notices they're headed that way, towards the nothing, and he watches with aghast, with dread and terror, to see them slowly approach it and throw themselves into it.
Wow, that's a great image. Yeah, because that's the image of the nothingness that kind of infects the modern world, isn't it?
Yeah, that's that unfair, that's the destruction of fair, that's the destruction of everything that's meaningful and good.
Yeah, there's a similar image in the Wizard of Earthsea, the third story of the Wizard of Earthsea, called The Farthest Shore, where the sinister character has tried to cheat death. And because they've tried to cheat death and not faced it, not actually dealt with it, they end up stripping magic completely from the world. The magic stops working, basically.
Oh, interesting.
All these poor wizards who are suddenly out of a job, but out of a life, because their whole life has been based around magic.
Yeah.
So you have to in some ways go on that journey. You have to confront the thing, because it is coming, and you need to be ready for it. And if you try to escape it by entering your consciousness into a meta universe, you will end up zombified, as you mentioned earlier.
Right. You end up zombified. The only options then at the end of it are either to be zombified or to seek out portals to fairy and thus be transformed, to be able to find that bridge, that pivot point. And I think that's the significance of the moon runes, the moon letters for us, is that they cannot be seen when you look straight at them,
I like
but
that.
only from an angle.
Like the shield of is it Perseus with Medusa or whatever, the shield that allows him to see the horrible thing, and so he can kill.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Very good.
And in
I
this
like
case, it's the light which guides you on your way. It's the moonlight in the dark night, in the night of the dark ages that are not only that Guardini and Nikolai Berdyaev say very clearly are upon us, or the birth of the new dark ages, where the night, which is closer to the primordial stuff of a new creation than the day is, you're guided by moonlight and starlight.
I love that. In a dark time, the eye begins to see.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly.
And that's why Elrond is such a great character, because Elrond has seen the darkness come and go, and he's calm, he's peaceful, he's a guide to others. That's wonderful. And it sets him on this quest to go on to the next great adventure,
Right.
What's next, which is I didn't plan it, but that's a really great place to stop,
It turns out, yeah.
That's awesome. I think that's why what we do too, Cameron, not just this podcast, but our teaching, our work with other people is so very, very important. Because part of what I think we both do is not just conveying information, it's really helping other people to learn how to see the moon letters. They aren't just members of EL Fudge Motors,
Yeah, I like that image. That's good.
So,
helping other people to see the moon letters.
Yeah, right. So thank you for all
That's
your
our
work.
task. Thank you, Will.
And I will see you next time I see you. And what's the traditional ending I keep trying to do and fail?
The tradition we haven't done yet.
All right, let me try. Okay.
Yeah.
So farewell, Cameron, wherever you fare, till your Aries receive you at the journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks.
All right. That works.
All right.
Bye-bye.